Okay, let's. I mean, I've set some of the terms for this topic about paradigms and epistemologies of research, reframing the standard picture. And in the last class, I was, in a manner of speaking, reconstructing this standard picture of social science research. Reconstructing the standard picture of social science research, hopefully in a interesting manner, by referring to two paradigms of social science research, which I deliberately called A and B, paradigm A and paradigm B. And the specificity of each of those paradigms was outlined in both at their epistemological and ontological levels, right, etc. Okay. Now, and I think there is something innovative and interesting which is set up once you render the paradigms of social scientific research along this mode that we have, that instead of calling positivist social science research versus, say, non-positivist social science research or interpretive social science research, I've tried to actually point out that research can be conceived along the lines suggested by paradigm A and by paradigm B. I think there is also a larger theoretical justification for the kind of procedure that I have followed. Because if for instance, you all have studied classical sociological theory, right? Okay, and one of the things, you would have been introduced to is about a certain tradition of positivism that is established by Comte, okay, which in a manner of speaking also translates and moves into the domain of Durkheim, right? So there is a certain line of thought that you can connect between the Comtean defense of positivism and Durkheim's articulations about a natural science of society that he was seeking, right? Etc. But what is interesting, and that's why people say that somewhere along the way, a certain positivist tradition that gets established in the Comtean frame gets consolidated in Durkheim, right? Etc. Okay, but what is interesting is that Durkheim, even as he inherits a certain tradition of positivism, he is also introducing some revisionism into that positivist framework that he inherits, right, etc. So that's why if instead of calling paradigm A as positivist and paradigm B as, say, interpretive, I've just tried to point out that there could well be revisionist currents read into the articulations that are a part of paradigm A. That's why Durkheim, in fact, Durkheim refuses that label positivist and in fact characterizes his method or methodology as what he calls naturalist, right? Etc. And there is a specific reason why he prefers that label for his articulations about social scientific method over and above the positivist identification. At the other end of the spectrum, if you're looking at non-positivist traditions, the interpretive tradition, as it were, which gets articulated in social science in the European context in the writings of Dilthey, and that gets transferred into one of the classical figures, Weber. Weber inherits the Diltheyan framework, right, of explanation versus understanding. But then what is interesting is that Weber, even as he inherits the interpretative neo-Kantian tradition, he also revises a lot of its coordinates, right? etc. In fact, one of the things that Weber does, and this is something that I keep emphasizing when I teach Weber, that Weber actually argues that this classification that natural sciences explain, social sciences understand, for Weber is not entirely capturing the specificity of both natural science and social science. In fact, Weber argues that there are interpretive elements in some of the sciences, just as there are explanatory components that the social sciences have to explore, and so on. So I think that's why I mean, this, if one characterizes social scientific debate as simply a quarrel between positivist and non-positivist approaches, now I think we don't capture some of the nuances that are intrinsic both to the ways in which the positivist tradition consolidated itself and the non-positivist or the interpretive tradition consolidated itself. Now, I've only given you a glimpse of it, okay, and I'm not going to go back into that historical intellectual context in which, say, Weber was writing or Durkheim was writing, and the traditions that they were seeking to revise in the context of what they were attempting to do. That's why I think there is some critical purchase that we can get when we render these paradigms or styles of social scientific research in this neutral language in which we have packaged it as paradigm A and paradigm B, right, etc. But I think there are some more interesting questions that follow from the construction of from the ways in which we have constructed certain components of paradigm A and certain components of paradigm B, right? Okay. Now, clearly, in the way in which we reconstructed the elements of paradigm A and the elements of paradigm B, one can clearly see that we are establishing a contrast, okay, or the ways in which their elements, their features have been formulated. There is a sharp and a striking contrast that is being highlighted, right? Okay, etc. So so somewhere in setting up elements of paradigm A versus elements of paradigm B, one was also, in a manner of speaking, trying to inform a certain sharp contrast between these two styles of social scientific research, right, etc. And what I've tried to indicate in my handout for you is that many times this contrast also translates into a dualism, right? Okay, I mean that, and what I mean by a dualism here is that you choose either or of these. You choose either paradigm A or you choose paradigm B, right, etc. So while the contrast can be interesting, I think the fact that the contrast can translate into a dualism is something we need to be a little wary of. I'll come to the dualism bit a little later, but I've already given you a sense of what this is all about. Incidentally, that's a methodological point. I mean, just because you contrast between two ideas or two figures or two frames, etc., not any contrast or every contrast between ideas, figures, frames need to translate into a dualism where you either have to take one or either side of the things. A dualism is one where you actually have to kind of work with either one or the other end of the contrast that is being established. And so I think the dualism bit, I'm going to keep it aside for the moment and just highlight the sharpness of the contrast that is being established between paradigm A and paradigm B in terms of opposing conceptions of objectivity, of reality, of truth, and so on. Right, and I think this, in a way, kind of sharpens the ideas that we have associated with paradigm A and the ideas that we have associated with paradigm B, right? Clearly, paradigm A is affirming an objective reality out there, independent of the observer, right? Whereas that this objective status that is ascribed to reality implies that there can be determinate lines of cause and effect, okay, which have to be discovered. I mean, there are determinate lines of cause and effect that underlie social historical phenomena, and the task of social science research is to capture these determinate lines of cause and effect relations between phenomena and so on, right? So, okay. Alternatively, paradigm B, in terms of its conception of reality, is denying this idea of an absolute objective reality independent of the observer, and claiming that reality is some kind of a construction, right? It's some kind of a social construction, okay, and that just as there can be a multiplicity of constructions of reality, there can also be a multiplicity of realities that get to be so constructed and so on. I mean, so you can see that in their conceptions of objective reality, there is a striking contrast that you can establish between paradigm A and paradigm B. Let's highlight more points of contrast between paradigm A and paradigm B. We also saw that there is a observer-observed separation that paradigm A institutes or establishes, right? Okay, so paradigm A posits a separation between the researcher, right, the observer, and the observed, the researched or object. Okay, whereas paradigm B blurs this distinction. Okay, I mean, and this translates into the emphasis that research conclusions are not findings, rather, or research findings are not are something that are co-constructed, right? They are created and not discovered through the interaction between the researcher and the researched, and so on. So conceptions of reality are also, in a manner of speaking, formulated very differently from within paradigm A and paradigm B. So there is no reality independent of the observer according to paradigm B, just as for paradigm A, reality is quite independent of the observer, and the observer's task is to discover the determinate lines of cause and effect that determine reality, and so on, right? So given these kind of contrasting conceptions of objectivity and reality, you also have contrasting conceptions of truth that underlie paradigm A and paradigm B. And I've already indicated this, that under paradigm A, there is a certain, we may call a picture theory of truth that is argued, whereas there is a different conception of truth, more as something which is negotiated and consensual between different constructions of truth, or different observers who may construct the truth in their own particular ways. So under paradigm A, broadly, you see a notion of truth as a correspondence between a research description, okay, and what is the case independent of the researcher. So there is some kind of a correspondence between thought and reality, language and reality, concepts and reality, right? The research description and what is the case independent of that research description, right? Etc. So it's so truth is a matter of correspondence to reality, whereas for paradigm B, truth becomes more a matter of consensus among constructors, among co-constructors or informed constructors, as it were, right? I mean, so the notions of fact that come from within paradigm A and paradigm B are also, consequently, strikingly different in that fact, for paradigm B does not, or what is fact or factual, right, does not exist independent of how the researcher constructs reality, whereas for paradigm A, facts is what makes propositions true. So facts are independent of our conceptions, and our conceptions must always correspond with the facts. And facts are what make propositions, our statements about reality, true or false, right, etc. I think this is all very clear. I mean, but I think it's important for us to rehearse these steps, right, and for the arguments that will follow. I think this rehearsal, which is perhaps very, very, there is something repetitive and perhaps given about it, in the sense that most of us, take it for granted that surely, there can be contrasting conceptions of objectivity, reality, and truth, as conceived from within paradigm, as conceived from within different frameworks, and so on. Right now, what is interesting, and I think what is important, is that this contrast translates into a dualism, right, between paradigm A and paradigm B, a dualism between contrasting conceptions of objectivity, reality, and truth, right? Of course, somebody might argue, I think we are simplifying the questions of objectivity through this framework of elucidation. We are simplifying conceptions of reality through this order of narration, and so on. And I think those are valid observations. But let us stick to our terms for the moment, right? And as the course proceeds, we will work with successive complications about some of these ideas that are being set up here, right? So I mean, this contrast in itself can be interesting, but to the extent that it translates into a dualism, where each paradigm presents itself as an alternative to the other. Right. So somewhere along the way, either you choose paradigm A and do research around the coordinates of paradigm A, or you choose to do research along the coordinates of paradigm B. That's where the dualism comes up, right? That when the paradigms are offered as alternatives to each other, right? So the limits of paradigm A are that if one highlights the limits of paradigm A, then one is actually jumping at paradigm B. And if one were to sound the limits of paradigm B, one would be harping through elements of paradigm A, right? So I think, but the contrast is striking, right? But to the extent that each of the paradigm present themselves as an alternative to the other, consequently, it translates into a dualism. And I think if I go by the general order of commentary on these paradigms of research and so on, you will find that often there is an argument that paradigm B is a more preferable alternative for the social sciences than paradigm A. That what makes the social sciences distinctive is actually the elements of paradigm B and so on, right? So even as the contrast is struck and it translates into a dualism, there is a marked preference for the elements of paradigm B rather than paradigm A, and that paradigm B is seen as an alternative to paradigm A in the context of social science research, right? it is precisely this formulation that paradigm B, okay, is a more viable alternative to paradigm A, that I think we need to confront. We need to, to engage with. So in other words, we need to critically engage with the terms, especially inherent to paradigm B, okay, even as one recognizes the problems inherent in paradigm A, right? So the solution to the problems of paradigm A need not always only be all the ingredients that we have read into paradigm B. There are problems inherent to paradigm B that we also need to come to terms with. And that, I think, is where we enter into a little more of critical nuance in the kind of ways in which we go about constructing these questions and so on, right? Okay, now, so what I'm going to do in the rest of the lecture, right, is to show the problems inherent in this dualism, okay, okay, and what is this dualism in the way we are constructing it? That not only are the two paradigms seen as alternatives to each other, there is also a tendency to prefer paradigm B, okay, to paradigm A, and that paradigm B is a more viable alternative to paradigm A, and so on. And the structure of my argument is, to show the problems inherent to the philosophical, to this, or to the philosophical position which underlies this dualism in the way I have just formulated it. And what I'm going to reiterate, right, and I've already said this in my handout that has been shared with you, is that some version of realism, right, some version of realism will need to be sustained, okay, if any form of constructivism is to take shape and yield interesting possibilities about the social world. So this idea of juxtaposing realism versus constructivism is actually a discussion about the terms of realism itself. So far from saying that constructivism is an alternative to realism, I think it's important to point out that somewhere along the way, we need to introduce more critical components into our conceptions of realism and so on. So that some version of realism, okay, will need to be sustained, okay, for any constructivism to kind of translate into certain interesting possibilities for social analysis and so on, right? Are there any clarifications at this point? Any? I hope I think I've been fairly clear in setting up the contrast and the dualism, and now I will move into transcending the dualism. But before I move into the critical questions about how to go about transcending this dualism, are there any clarifications that any of you might want to seek? And please feel free to speak. It's clear? Any doubts, any clarifications, any comments, observations? I'll move ahead. Okay, right. Let me move into this more critical discussion, which I think engages with the challenge of transcending this dualism, that in the way we have set it up, right, etc. And please note, it might seem that we are setting up I mean, somebody might argue, no, we are setting up a scarecrow, and then feel proud that we have demolished that scarecrow. I mean, but that happens invariably in arguments and so on. But I think in the critical literature that surrounds these methodological debates in the social sciences, both historically and methodologically, I think these terms, in the ways in which we have tried to set it up, offers kind of interesting possibilities, right? Of course, you can set it up in very different ways, but we have chosen to set it up along these lines by constructing a standard picture of social science research through paradigm A and paradigm B, articulated its coordinates at a certain level of abstraction, then tried to understand, what is the contrast between the two, and then try to point out that in themselves the contrast is striking and interesting, but to the extent that that it translates into this dualism, where one is offered as an alternative to the other, or paradigm B is seen as a more viable alternative to paradigm A, there are a lot of questions that can come up. So that's why at this starting point of transcending the dualism, to the extent that we see paradigm B as a more viable alternative for social scientific research, I think it might be useful for us to address the terms and contents of paradigm B. As I say in the handout in my PPT, there is something deeply puzzling about paradigm B, right? And what is puzzling about paradigm B is that it seems to be articulating, a sense of social construction in an absolute sense, right? And any conception of social construction in an absolute sense is inconceivable, right? And that's okay. So this is very important, that any idea of social construction in an absolute sense, that everything is constructed, right? I mean, what I mean by absolute sense is that everything is constructed, right? And what is that every aspect of reality is constructed. I mean, that kind of absolute social constructivism or constructionism in an absolute sense is inconceivable, right? In other words, why do I say it is inconceivable? Surely there is something real, obtaining, right? I mean, the construction is about something, right? Etc. So the construction itself is as real as that something about which the construction is speaking about, right? That certain conditions, right? When you say that there is something real obtaining, what one is also highlighting is that there are certain conditions prevailing independent of us, which kind of formulate the basis of the construction, right? Etc. Right? So construction in an absolute sense, that everything is constructed, right, is inconceivable, because there is something real obtaining, underlying any construction, in the sense that there are certain conditions that make a construction possible, right? There are certain conditions that are independent of the construction that go into the making of the construction. That's why Hacking's reminder, right? Don't ask only for the meaning, ask for the point, is very important, right? Etc. And I think it's important to point out construction, social construction, or any idea of social construction in an absolute sense is a impossibility, right? Or it cannot be, it's hardly conceivable, right? And that's why even within science, even as relativity theory repudiates some of the conceptions of the mechanical conception of the world, that comes from Newton and others. Nevertheless, it's not as though relativity is denying certain coordinates that obtain as part of the mechanical conception of the universe that comes from Newtonian science or Newtonian physics and so on, right, etc. It's adding to the to a more complex conception of reality, relativity theory, as adding to a more complex conception of reality that science has to address. Okay, so this idea of construction, social construction in an absolute sense, is inconceivable. Now, somebody can argue that if one makes an argument like this, that somebody can argue that to say that there is something real obtaining in the sense of certain conditions prevailing independent of us, which go into the making of constructions, this is not necessary to place oneself in paradigm A, right? Okay. So I think some of the elements of paradigm A have to be some of the core elements of paradigm A have to be actively resisted, right, etc. But in the process of resisting paradigm A, okay, we need to be careful about wholly committing to the ingredients of paradigm B, okay, or alternatively, as I put in the handout, okay, it's a deep mistake to assume that the answers to paradigm A are paradigm B, right, etc. So the problems inherent in paradigm A can be circumvented if you move into paradigm B, etc. Right? So that's why I think there is a certain. There are conceptions. There is a real that needs addressing, just as we recognize that the real is never independent of the construction that is placed on it. And many times the construction has to be explained, itself, in which case there is something real about the construction that we need to come to terms with, right? The fact, let me elaborate on this a little more, okay? The fact that there is a world out there, or let's put it, a physical world out there, necessitates a science of the physical world, right? Etc. So that's why I've already pointed out that Newtonian mechanics as a science of the physical world highlights one aspect of the physical world, right? Just as relativity theory also seeks to add another element to our understanding of the reality of the physical world. So the fact that there is a physical world out there necessitates a science of the physical world. Okay, and I think nobody can deny this, right? But on that basis is one to conclude, therefore, okay, that there is no science of the personal and social worlds possible, right, etc. And many times people who speak about from within paradigm A actually reiterate that that the social and personal world, if it has to be addressed, it has to be addressed by the tools of science, and consequently, if the tools of science are not able to access the social and personal worlds, somewhere along the way the social and personal worlds may not exist, right, etc. Okay, so I think it's important to point out that there is a science of the personal and social worlds possible, just as there is a science of the physical world possible, and a quick translation across methodologies for the study of the science of the physical world into the study of the social and personal world is definitely problematic. But nevertheless, there are particular worlds that we need to address, and so on, right? Incidentally, there are also discoveries in science, right? As there are constructions in science. In fact, if I might refer to a little more historical point, there is actually an interesting debate that takes place. I think a debate is perhaps a an over characterization, but nevertheless, there is a small exchange between Charles Taylor and Thomas Kuhn, right? The noted historian of science, right? And what is, now I will be speaking about Charles Taylor in the second segment of our course. There is this essay, the famous essay, Interpretation of the Sciences of Man, that I will be, recalling aspects of at the second level of the course, in the second segment of our course. I will be saying, so what Kuhn is doing is responding to that essay, that iconic essay by Charles Taylor called Interpretation and the Sciences of Man. And what is interesting for me, and I think what for keen students of the history of science and the history of social science, is that Kuhn asks a very critical question of Charles Taylor, right? He argues that, Charles Taylor argued that interpretation constitutes the basis of the human sciences, right? Etc. Right? So there is a contrast that you can make between natural science and social science. And what sets apart social science from natural science is the demands of interpretation that Taylor reads only as specific to the social sciences, right? Or the human sciences. Kuhn actually pins on this. He says that yes, a contrast between natural science and social science has to be established, but it cannot ride on the simple fact that interpretation is present in one and absent in the other, right? So the idea of interpretation as the marker that sets apart social sciences from the natural sciences is terribly delimiting, and that in fact interpretive hermeneutic elements also obtain in the sciences, right? So what Kuhn tries to do is that yes, there is a line to be drawn between natural science and social science, but the line cannot be drawn on the simple fact of interpretation being present in one and absent in another, right? That's a small debate. It does not get carried forward, sadly, at least in terms of Taylor engaging with Kuhn's position and so on, etc. But this is a historical fact. There is a little exchange that takes place between the two, and so on. And Kuhn actually tells us that interpretive elements, hermeneutic elements, meaningful elements also are part of the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, and biology, and so on. So there are discoveries in science as there are constructions in science, right? Etc. So I think it's important to keep this in mind as we as we commit ourselves to the challenges of paradigm B, and also seek to confront the limits of that position, which argues that that answers to paradigm A are actually in paradigm B, and so on, right? Of course, there is something specific about the social world, about our personal worlds, right? It cannot be denied, as I say it here, it cannot be denied that the language of emotions, the language of motives, the language of rights, the language of obligations, intentions, aspirations, attitudes, feelings, institutions, and practices, okay, are all, there is something socially dynamic about them, constructive and dynamic about them, right? Because there is something clearly where these aspects of social reality are somehow created and recreated through acts of construction, okay? But the fact is that therefore there cannot be one true account of social reality, because social reality presents itself through alternative constructions about itself and so on. But the key question, what one is saying is, right, how do we, I mean, we are not denying the specificity of social science, right, etc., and the specificity of social and personal worlds that social science addresses, right, but to believe that there are certain consequences that follow from this recognition of distinctiveness, etc. So the demands of paradigm B have to be adhered to, but the translation of paradigm B cannot be an absolute constructivism, right, etc. Okay, so in other words, and that's why I'm saying that while there cannot be one true account of social reality or social and historical worlds, etc., one also needs to be addressing the intelligibility of this claim, right, etc. Okay, I mean, it's one thing to say that there are multiple realities, okay, and quite another to say that there are different ways in which reality is conceived, right? I mean, this is again impinging on the questions of the turn to ontology that I was raising in the last few classes, right, etc. So it's one, I mean, there is a clear distinction that we can be making between one set of claims which speaks about multiple realities, okay, and quite another to say that there are different ways in which reality is conceived, because and in fact the reality may be conceived differently by different people. The same reality may be conceived differently by different people because of different interests and traditions to which people belong, etc. Okay, but I think the claim, okay, that there cannot be one true account has to confront this this fact or this possibility, okay, that one thing to say that there are multiple realities, it's quite another to say that there are different ways in which reality is conceived or conceivable, and so on. Okay, in other words, and I think this is a crucial point, while there are limits to the number of ways in which we might conceptualize social life, okay, there is no limit. There is no limit to the number of ways in which we may conceptualize social life. There are limits to how social life gets to be organized, right, etc. Right. So somewhere there is a certain organization of social life that we need to address. Okay, just as social life may be conceived from very different points of view, right? So there can be different. There can be no limit to the number of ways in which social life is conceived, but there are limits to how social life gets organized. So yes, there can be different capitalisms, okay, but the distinctiveness of each form of capitalist organization of social life has to be addressed. So somebody might argue that Asian capitalisms are different from, say, European capitalisms, right? Etc. Okay, true, very true. But there is a certain way in which social life is organized that we need to address, even as we recognize that there are different ways in which social life can be conceptualized and conceived and so on. Right? In fact, that's why it's also important to keep asking this question, right? That if there are different constructions of the world, what makes possible these different constructions of the world, right? Okay. I mean, so there is something real, right, quote unquote, which obtaining, and the real here is certain conditions, which prevail independent of us, which go to constitute some of the basis of our constructing the world in the way we do. So it's one thing to point out that there can be different conceptions of the world, but surely surely there is, at least theoretically, there may be an infinity of conceptions of the world, but in real actual terms, there are limits to how many constructions of the world get to be possible, and so on. So it's a deep mistake to assume that because naive realism is unacceptable, right, one has to adopt absolute social constructivism or social constructionism, right, etc. Okay, so why? Yes, naive realism is definitely a problem, right? But in challenging naive realism, one need not jump into the other extreme of absolute social construction. Right. Incidentally, if you, I mean, I have not listed this in the bibliography, but if students want to read, because a lot of us are part of the constructivist turn, right, so to say, right? I mean, so many turns. Okay, and most of us find our critical charge coming from the constructivist turn. But it's important to sound the limits of the constructivist turn. And I think one of the best books that I've found on that subject, right, is Ian Hacking. And that's why the lines that I quoted from him: don't ask for the meaning, ask for what's the point, right, etc. So if, yes, there are many constructions of the world, okay, but why is the world being constructed in the way it is? By X in that way, Y in another way, Z in another way, and so on. And then we begin to see some kind of that this dualism between realism versus constructivism might actually have to be transcended, and so on. And the book from which I was quoting that lines is The Social Construction of What? I mean, that's what the title of the book by Ian Hacking, The Social Construction of What? And I mean, you can read the introduction to that book, and the quotation that I mean, those lines that I quoted from Hacking are from the early pages of The Social Construction of What, right? Okay, now are there any comments or observations at this point? I mean, I hope you're getting the drift of what I'm arguing. I only see, please be a little sensitive to my side of things, right? Because I just have these inert images, R, N, A, and some profile pictures shown. That's it, right? Etc. I mean, in a classroom situation, even if you all kept quiet, there was a certain reception that happens anyway, right? Etc. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Nikhil. Right. But Raunak, you had something to say?
No, sir. I just mentioned that. Yeah, we understand.
Okay. Yeah. So I mean, so sometimes please interject. I mean, just say yes, we understand. I mean, or I understand. I mean, you could surely you cannot be speaking for everybody, etc. But you can always say yes, I do understand, or yes, this is what. Although, of course, I mean, I'm keen to know what this understanding is about. In fact, one of the things that I've often found in the context of my lectures is that students do understand what is being said. Okay, but what is the significance of what is being said? That's a different matter altogether, right? Etc. And so that's why understanding, understanding a lecture is one thing. Okay, drawing the significance of it is quite another dimension, right? And that's why when I urge these clarificatory questions from your end, I'm also trying to get a measure of whether, yes, you have understood and drawn the right implication, the significance of what is being said. And I think the critical task and which is actually a translational process, right, is not so much the understanding of an idea, right, etc., but what is the significance you are attaching to it. Of course, the significance may be explained in the context of the theme that we are discussing, but I'm more interested in where you take these ideas towards, that, etc. That's why I'm saying, that's why I think I said this in my first class, right, that students are very good in summarizing an essay, right? So you read Partha Chatterjee, or you read Ian Hacking, the Introduction to Social Construction of What, or the readings that I've shared with you in this course, reading and Andrew Abbott, the reading that I've shared with you, or that other reading that I shared with you about from about theory and theorizing, that comes, which is from Richard Swedberg, or the introduction that I shared from Andrew Sayer, Method in Social Science, a Realistic Approach, and so on. I'm sure you will be able to summarize some of those readings, but that's not only that's not the only skill that we need to have. I mean, writing summaries of what people have said, right, is easily done. Okay, translating what they have said, drawing lines of significance, connecting ideas with other ideas, right, is the critical task, right, etc. And that's that's why it becomes quite critical for us to engage with the terms that I have set. But yes, I think I have been fairly clear in drawing the limits of the dualism, etc. And I want to move into another core aspect of this questioning of this dualism, I have termed it for the the uniqueness fallacy, right? And I mean, there is a reason why I'm fixing on this fallacy in the context of transcending the dualism between between realism, naive realism, and absolute social constructionism, or paradigm A and paradigm B, and so on, right? And I think that's why I have, in fact, in my PPT, it's a separate heading in which I have kind of constituted these observations about the uniqueness fallacy, right? Now, as I say it in the handout, transcending the dualism also means coming to terms with what in the literature, I mean, you can Google and so on, is called the uniqueness fallacy, right? I mean, of course, there are many fallacies that are spoken about in the methodological literature, but I want to pin on this particular fallacy that I think underlies a lot of the ways in which we see and imagine possibilities for social scientific research, and so on, or even scientific research for that matter, right, etc. So transcending the dualism also means coming to terms with what I have termed, or what can be termed, what is termed by others as the uniqueness fallacy. Now, what is the uniqueness fallacy? I mean, fallacy means a mistake, right? A fallacy means something some kind of a misplaced argument, right? It's an error, right? And please note, it's actually a unproductive error, because sometimes errors can be productive, mistakes can be productive, etc. But when we are talking of a fallacy here, we are talking about a mistake which is unproductive, which is a dead end, which perhaps constricts debate, and so on, right? So what we can call the uniqueness fallacy is the mistake, okay, in concluding, okay, that, I mean, it's one thing to say that every event, right, is unique in some respect. I mean, and that's a right thing to say, that every event is unique in some respect. But what the uniqueness fallacy translates into is that on the basis, it concludes from the fact that every event is unique in some respect, that it concludes that every event is unique in every respect. I mean, the emphasis is on arguing about uniqueness of things in some ways and uniqueness of things in every way, right? The uniqueness fallacy is the mistake in concluding that from the fact that something is unique in some respect and concluding that everything is unique, every event is unique in every respect. Right now, for instance, I can give the example. I might say that our languages, Telugu, Tamil, or the language that I speak, which is my mother tongue, Tulu, they are unique. There is something unique about these languages, Kannada or Bengali. There is something unique about these languages, but their uniqueness does not mean that they are unique in every respect, right? Etc. I mean, so uniqueness doesn't necessarily mean that something which is unique has to be rendered as distinctive and singular in every aspect of it. I mean, something can share a language, like Tulu might share with Kannada, or Tulu might share with Telugu, right? Or Bengali might share with Sanskrit, Telugu might share with Sanskrit, Tamil might share with Sanskrit, etc. Okay, and still have something unique. I mean, languages may share with each other and still have something unique as a language, right? Etc. Right. So, and I think, and there is a reason why I'm fixing on this. There is a reason why I'm fixing on this uniqueness fallacy, because a lot of our arguments about socio-historical reality actually stem from the uniqueness of the events that constitute social and historical reality, right? Okay, and so we believe that every reality is new in a particular kind of a way, right? Etc. Now, I think it's a serious mistake to actually constitute new as absolutely new in every way, and it's another to say that no, a new may have something which is shared with the old and yet still be new, right? Etc. That's why this uniqueness fallacy, right, is something that has to be moved beyond. So transcending the dualism also implies the imperative of moving beyond what is being termed here as the uniqueness fallacy. I mean, as I clarify in the note, it is true that every condition, each condition or situation is unique, right? Okay. I mean, its uniqueness may consist, if not in the actual acts that constitute it, maybe in the definitions and interpretations given to those acts by the participants, right? So uniqueness can obtain both at the level of the event itself, and it can obtain also in the meanings and interpretations of those participants in the events, right? So it is true that each condition or situation is unique, right? But unique in one respect does not entail uniqueness in every respect, right? Etc. Okay. Now that's why I think it's important that we in fact, there is a wonderful exchange, and this is a real life commentary, where there is this fascinating book on Tamil, a biography of Tamil that the Indologist and classical the Sanskritist and Indologist critical Indologist, David Schulman, writes on Tamil. He writes a wonderful biography of Tamil, right? And that book is reviewed by this wonderful modern historian, equally resolute, equally sharp, who's that MIDS, Venkat Chalapathy, right? And what Venkat Chalapathy does is to point out that, look, what Schulman was arguing in the book is that Tamil borrows a lot from Sanskrit, right? Etc. So there are certain crossovers between Tamil and Sanskrit that is happening, which is part of the biography of Tamil itself, right? Etc. And Chalapathy actually points out that in the process of speaking of the crossover between Tamil and Sanskrit, the uniqueness of Tamil is lost. That's his critical observation, Chalapathy's critical observation. And it's interesting to see what David Schulman responds. And David Schulman responds that just because Tamil borrows from Sanskrit, right, doesn't in any way negate the uniqueness of Tamil, right? I mean, that there is something distinctive about the language and its history, of its biography, even as it shares with other languages and so on. And I think this sharing between Sanskrit and Tamil, I think, can be true also of all the other languages. So it's not. I mean, this fertility between languages that one is establishing between Tamil and Sanskrit, I think, is a fertility that you can establish across this. And there is fascinating work on this by the critical Indologist Sheldon Pollock on the rise and fall of Sanskrit and what Sanskrit does to the vernaculars, the rise of vernaculars, what it does to Sanskrit, and so on, right? So there's a fascinating world, social historical world of linguistic and social change that has to be mapped out. But I think the larger, the more substantial point that one is talking about in the light of these thing is that just because each condition or situation is unique doesn't mean necessarily that uniqueness in one respect does not entail uniqueness in every respect, right? So the fallacy, the mistake consists in assuming or taking as a given the fact that something is unique in some respect and taking it that this uniqueness is unique in every respect, right? I mean, just because it is unique in some respect doesn't in any way negate the fact that it shares, and in sharing with others, that uniqueness is not lost, and so on, right? So what this critical set of remarks implies, right, is that in social scientific descriptions, okay, to understand a practice, right, requires a certain careful and diligent attention to that practice, right, etc. So to understand a practice, to understand a certain sequence of events, requires careful and diligent analysis of that sequence of events, of that practice, the many situations that underlie those events or that practice, the norms that underlie the practice, the underlying rules of the practice, the interpretations that participants give to that practice, okay, the values and aims that are embedded in the practice, and so on, right? And obviously, this requires more qualitative forms of research work, right? Etc. Okay, but what one is saying is that such qualitative pieces of work, okay, maybe merely setting the limits or giving a greater refinement to the more general and more quantifiable claims that research can and also must entail. That's why this binary that we institute between qualitative methods and quantitative methods, or survey research versus ethnography, I think is again a very false binary, as it were, and I mean, this setting up of this opposition between quantitative studies and qualitative studies, I think is again a false binary that we need to engage with. In fact, I mean, just on Tuesday, we had this day-long meeting on Raymond Williams, and although a lot of the presentations were subsuming a literary cultural universe, there is a sense in which our engagement with the literary cultural universe has to draw on sociological tools of analysis. And a lot of what Raymond Williams did in the kind of analysis of the tools of literature and society, culture and society that he was establishing, also made use of certain theoretical and conceptual tools that come from, say, social scientific analysis and so on. In fact, there were some very interesting biographical details about Raymond Williams, also illustrated on the context of the day, which clearly implies that this kind of this debate over methods and constructing the debate over methods as versus is definitely problematic, etc. Of course, I know that we can always say we can have multiple methods of research, right? But please note, whatever methods we use, whether qualitative, whether quantitative, whether mixture of qualitative and quantitative, I think there is a certain demands of data, the demands of theory, and the demands of method that has to be adhered, as it were. In fact, whenever I guide my students, I often tell them, think with your sources. Okay, think also with your sources of data. Don't only think with your problem, okay, of research. Think also with the sources that you're going to use to amplify the problem of your research, right? The sources of data and so on. And the sources could be quantitative, they could be qualitative, they could be primary, they could be secondary, and there are deep confusions that students nurse about primary and secondary data, about quantitative and qualitative research, and so on. In fact, I'm very fond of repeating this. I mean, I remember 20, 30 years ago confronting this wonderful ethnography, a kind of a very deep ethnography coming from one of the last students of Lévi-Strauss. He's now a very big name in French academic circles and in French anthropology. The name of the scholar is Philippe Descola, right? And Philippe Descola, in his doctoral thesis, which later came as a book, actually speaks about, the title of the book is called In the Society of Nature, and he looks at the Amazon forests and in the interiors of the Amazon among the Achuar. I mean, he looks at one group of people, the Achuar. And what is interesting about the ethnography, right, is that this division between, say, what is quantitative technique and what is a purely qualitative technique is actually pushed to the wayside. In fact, as part of his ethnography, he also speaks about measurement, right? Because many times in qualitative research, we think that phenomena exist beyond measurement, right? I mean, that feelings, how do you measure feelings, etc., right? I mean, I'm not saying that there are no problems with the measurement of feelings, right? But there are ways in which our critical measures become quite critical. And Descola actually, in order to make his larger theoretical argument, actually in the ethnography, not only speaks about their ways of life, but also, tries to demonstrate their practices measures those practices in quantitative ways to argue for this larger theoretical argument of the sociality of nature and so on, right? That's why I think it's. I mean, in other words, what it means is, being attentive to a practice. I mean, yes, we are all trying to theorize practices, social and historical practices, and what does it mean to be careful and diligent in the analysis and the engagement with the practices becomes critical. So more. Let me just write the last line in this lecture, and in the next class I will sum it up in the next class. Knowing the social world along the lines broadly of paradigm B actually can clear the ground for paradigm A. So instead of saying that there is a opposition between paradigm A and paradigm B, we can actually point out, give a more sober conclusion that knowing the social world along the lines of paradigm B can clear the ground actually for paradigm A. And moreover, paradigm A may be suggestive of differences which can be explored along the lines of paradigm B, right? So somewhere the kind of harmony of methods and data and theory writ large across the spaces of paradigm A and paradigm B can be harmonized. That's why you have to transcend the dualism of naive realism versus absolute social constructionism and so on. That constructs the terms that I've set in today's class, where I'm transcending the dualism. I have some last points to strike about a realist social science, and I will do that separately instead of kind of combining and jumping over it in today's class. I'll speak about a realist social science a little more fully in the next class, in the beginning part of next class, and start with also with PPT 3 towards the latter part of the class, unless of course you have a lot of questions in the light of what we have been discussing so far, in which case I can defer my treatment of PPT 3 for the class next week, but in the latter part of next week. But otherwise I will hope to start with PPT 3 in the latter half of the next class. Anyway, that's about it. Any questions? As part of this lecture, so that it can also become part of the recording. But otherwise, if there are no questions, I will switch off the recording and then say goodbye. Any questions? Any thoughts on this uniqueness fallacy that I presented for you? Have you thought? You see, it seems so obvious. It seems so obvious, but at least the larger point that we are making seems so obvious, but it's striking. The fact that something so obvious that's just because something is unique in some respect doesn't mean that it is unique in every respect, etc.
Uniqueness is not a monolith.
Sorry?
Uniqueness is not a monolith that way.
Yes. No, I think I know. I don't think it's merely a question of uniqueness. Of heterogeneity. Because when you say that something is not a monolith, that means you're saying that it is heterogeneous.
Yeah.
But, that's true. Absolutely true, Raunak. But I think there is a larger lesson to be got from this, because see, how does this heterogeneity obtain? So how does this monolith break down? Right? I think the critical task is not demolishing monoliths, but in actually trying to translate the implications of multiplicity and heterogeneity. right? I mean, breaking down a monolith is very easy, but coming to terms with the disaggregated elements that come with the breaking down of the monolith becomes very critical, right? And somewhere a lot of social science is essentially about reassembling things that you break down into their constitutive elements, etc. So I think so. It's not just an argument for breaking down grand narratives. I mean, you have this whole postmodern view that about what is called the exhaustion with grand narratives, or etc. Right? It's possible to remain grand, right, and still work with more disaggregated perspectives on the world, and so on. So somewhere one is talking about. In fact, in the Raymond Williams. It was a long day. We started only around 12 noon and went on till around 8 o'clock. We stuck to the time. But I think in fact, I was speaking only towards the end and I was pretty exhausted. But before I made my own presentation, there was a great presentation on culture, identity, race, nation in Raymond Williams, right? And somewhere along the way, one found a new argument and for how the universal and the particular, right, can be harmonized, right? And so somewhere the language of the universal, right, and the language of the particular, have to be brought into a kind of a critical engagement. I mean, to disclose the provincialism of things is not sufficient, right? I'm absolutely clear. To establish the provincialism of something is not sufficient. It's also important to work with the multiplicity of provincialisms, because once you say that something is provincial, everything is provincial, then you're dealing with a multiplicity. But what visions of the universal or of the grand narrative come from these alternative articulations of the provincial, or the multiple articulations of the provincial, become a critical task. Anyway, but thanks for that nudge, Raunak. Okay, that's it then. So we finished the class. I'll switch off the recording. Okay, yeah. Yes, Revati, it's still being recorded. I hope you don't mind that.
That's okay, sir. I just
want you'll have to be a little louder. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I just wanted to know, in your PPT, in the end, you said that how paradigm A can set the ground for exploring differences alongside, like on the basis of paradigm B. So when we say that, in some way, are we saying that that once we know that some event or some practice is this is the real way that it functions, it allows us to explore that other understandings of it?
No. What I think is saying that there is a real that has to be addressed, even as the real obtains in the context of constructions. So one is not talking about the real in some metaphysical sense that there is something really real going on, right, etc. Right? We are talking about a real that obtains. Okay, that's there, that is out there, even as people are bringing different meanings and interpretations to it, etc. So one is talking about the real as offering the terms which the constructivist position or paradigm B will have to take forward.
So on the basis of something that exists out there, there are different interpretations of it that can exist, because there is something real that is taking place for us to be able to understand in the first place.
That's right. And there is something real about the interpretation. See, right. Why do one set of people interpret that situation or that event in this way, And why do another set of people interpret the same event or that situation in another kind of a way?
Right.
They are as material and real as the fact that there are multiple constructions of reality. That's why I think you should just go back to the difference that I posited in the previous PPT about transcending the dualism, where I say that it is one thing to say that there are multiple realities, and quite another to say that there are different ways in which reality is conceived, right?
Yes.
And these different ways in which reality is conceived are not just conceptions. They are also making the world, at least for them who are part of those conceptions. Right? They are real. They are real for those who are constructing the world and making the world intelligible in that way. So there is something ontological about the conceptions that they bring to the world that we need to address. Yeah?
Yes, understood. Thank you, sir.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay, that's about it. So let me just switch off the recording.